Morning, everybody. I'm Nicola Barrett, Chief Corporate Learning Officer at Emory Executive Education at Goizueta Business School. Welcome back to everybody who's attended Business Over Breakfast sessions before, and welcome to those who are new to Business Over Breakfast. And for everybody with the slightest bit of Irish in your background, happy St. Patrick's Day. Mobile devices, mine is right here, have become such a fixture in our everyday lives. It's like having a pair of shoes. It goes everywhere with you. At the end of 2021, the number of unique mobile internet users stood at just over 4.3 billion and continues to grow. This explosion in mobile devices has cracked open a whole new world of data mining, from geolocation and banking routines to shopping habits and social networks. Here with us today to explore how marketers are seizing the mobile data opportunities unleashed by this proliferation of mobile devices is Michelle Andrews, Assistant Professor of Marketing at the Goizueta Business School. With nearly a decade-long streak of winning awards for best papers and publications, I'm really proud that Michelle was named a Marketing Science Institute 2021 Young Scholar. And that's an award which recognizes market researchers whose early careers are the most promising. Michelle's research on digital marketing and field experimentation has been published in a number of leading journals and magazines. And she's currently working on quantifying the impact of requesting people's permission to track them across apps and other mobile websites. Michelle will share some of her insights and research from her research for the first sort of 30-35 minutes. And then we will have a Q&A session. So please as usual, put your questions in the Q&A section at the bottom or the chat, and we will ask them. But before I hand over to Michelle, I did want to let you know of some other new and hopefully you think exciting initiatives that we have been working on. First of all, we've launched a marketing analytics certificate program in partnership with Upgrad. And so I invite you to check this out if you want to boost your marketing capability. Also, we've been working on a virtual reality simulation that we developed and have in our upcoming negotiations course. So rather than negotiating only against a fellow student or participant in the program, you actually are in a VR environment and negotiating against that avatar, which is sort of exciting. Also, we've been developing a crisis leadership simulation that we've built in the last, actually it's taken us about 12 months. And we are launching that to our executive education population in the upcoming managerial leadership program. And last but not least, for those who want to, go back to school, get some more credits, you can. Executive education will be offering places in a number of our executive and evening MBA electives. And for those who are interested in marketing, and I suspect a lot of you are, as you've joined us today, there's a course on product and brand management with Doug Bowman, and another on pricing strategy and analytics with Saloni Vastani. So they'll be on our website in a few weeks, and classes start at the end of August. Some exciting developments. But over to Michelle so that she can share her exciting research with all of us. Thanks, Michelle, and welcome.
Thank you, Nicola, and welcome everyone. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so we have some things to look at. Let's see, reality check. Can we see this? Yes.
Yes, we can.
Thank you, Nicola. Okay, so today what we're going to be doing is discussing some insights that marketers in particular, but we'll expand beyond marketers when we can, have been able to derive from mobile data. So Nicola actually started us off by talking about how many people own a mobile phone and use the analogy of it's like a pair of shoes. We have it basically almost all the time. So to kind of wrap our minds around why mobile data can be so informative, let's go to the chat and see who can get this right. The question is, on average, how many times a day do we check our phone? 75, 347. So, okay, 10. Okay, some people are very good about staying away from the phone. 1,040. The answer is 96. So again, that's just average. But if you think about it, almost 100 times a day, we are looking at that screen. That provides immense opportunities for marketers to be able to communicate with us. And this is what I mean. So first of all, to make sure we're all on the same page, a lot of times when people talk about mobile data, they're talking about a very specific piece of information that is coming from mobile phones, or basically any GPS-enabled devices. And that is location data. What we mean by location data is basically time-stamped, meaning we know exactly what time this piece of information was emitted by a device, latitude and longitude coordinates. So we know exactly where that device was when it emitted a signal. And the reason this is super, super powerful is that traditionally what marketers have been doing is using mobile data for targeting purposes. So how marketers have been doing this is through tower triangulation. So what tower triangulation is it's a way to basically find the exact location of our devices. And it works by basically sending a signal to the device and measuring how long it takes that signal to go back to the tower. You have 3 towers that do that, boom, you pinpoint the location of this GPS device. We'll stick to talking about mobiles for today's talk. And how they've been taking advantage of knowing exactly where people are is by sending them very time-sensitive coupons. So what we mean by this is a lot of times marketers have been using what we call geofences. What geofences are is they are virtual perimeters that are set up outside of a store. And the idea is if somebody is in proximity to a store, that might indicate that they have greater interest in the offerings of the store. But the other thing too is this concept of impulse purchases. If I'm close to a store and I get a message that kind of encourages me to go in the store, I'm much more likely to actually go in that store than if I'm sitting at home and I get a message saying, hey, 30% off of, your purchases today. So we've seen that happening a lot. The thing about setting up geofences using cell phone towers is they're only accurate within about 30 feet. So if we want to get even more accurate, what we're seeing marketers do is use what are called beacons. Now, beacons they're a locating system that run on low Bluetooth energy, LBE. This is as opposed to traditional Bluetooth. And how it works is, as the name implies, it basically sends a signal to any device within its proximity and waits for the device sends the signal and it emits a reply signal. And so, for example, if we're in a store, let's say Macy's, maybe similar to how outside the store can indicate interest, inside the store, maybe by sending a coupon for a discount on shoes, that also includes a map in the store where the shoe section is, it can actually increase purchase likelihood. We see this happening outside of what we think of traditional purchase situations. So a lot of entertainment venues will take Major League Baseball as an example. Every single Major League Baseball stadium is now equipped with beacons all over the stadium. What the intent of this is that if you're a spectator attending a game, the hope is that you actually download the app, and the app is going to try to provide you very context-specific information, such as where are the nearest bathrooms, where can you get a beer, hey, here's $2 off of a hot dog. But on the backside of that, what each stadium is trying to do, as well as the team, is gather information such as, okay, when there was a lull in the game, how many people actually got up and went to eat? And if it's not at the level that we want, can we kind of nudge them to do so by sending them a coupon, etc.? So the idea or the hope is that this is a symbiotic relationship. Okay, so another example of how we've seen kind of geo-targeting being used in what we'll call the real world is movie theaters. So the thing about movie theaters is that as soon as one person buys a movie ticket, the theater has to show the movie. But let's say we have 200 extra seats that we wish to fill, even if we have to take, you know, a discount on the ticket that we're selling. And a lot of times theaters will wait basically until the last minute because they don't know what the demand is going to be. Ahead of time, we might already assume at 10 a.m. on a Saturday, the theater is not going to be filled. So what theaters such as IMAX have actually done is they've worked with researchers like myself, and we've sent out these geo-fenced mobile promotions. And they've actually found that those who are closest to the theater are more likely to go ahead and buy IMAX theater tickets. And the intuition behind this is theaters have what are called clearing circles. So the greater the distance from the theater, the less they know you're going to actually go to the theater. And so what they do is they kind of wait first to say, okay, within about a 10-minute walking distance, let's send X amount of coupons, see how many people buy. If it meets what we're aiming for, we're good. If it doesn't, we'll start broadening that circle and also deepening the discounts to try to kind of increase the likelihood or the persuasion of people to buy tickets. Okay, next question. How many times a week do you find yourself in close proximity to strangers? Okay, seems like an odd question. By the way, your teenage children do not count. And let's pretend pandemic never happened, so kind of life is back to normal, okay? Few for some people. Depending if we live in a city, we're commuting a lot for another people. All right, the reason we are asking this question is because, again, we're talking about mobile phones, and remember how many times we check our mobile phones? 96 times a week. It just so happens that we actually check our phones a lot more when we find ourselves in, for many people, the uncomfortable situation of kind of being close to people that we don't know. Think about getting on the elevator, or if we're in a city, we get on the subway, we have to commute, maybe we're in line to buy our lunch. It just so happens that there's a psychological term called mobile immersion, and this is how it works. A lot of times, to kind of avoid catching someone's unwanted glance, or because we're uncomfortable in the situation, we automatically pull out our phone and just start checking our phone or doing things on our phone. And so that provides another opportunity for marketers to go ahead and basically try to communicate with consumers. And so we've seen this actually happen in different environments. So for example, a prime environment is where what we call captive audiences are. Think about, for example, Penn Station in New York City. A lot of people are basically waiting for their train before they go ahead downstairs and board the train. The thing about mobile technology is not only can we tell where a single person is, we can also tell via the pings of other devices how many people are around them. And so because of this idea of a mobile immersion, a prime opportunity to actually target consumers could be when they're in crowded situations in which we actually believe they're around strangers. Okay, contrast this with the baseball stadium. Baseball stadium, everyone is there for the purpose of watching the game, okay? And so maybe our dislike for strangers is going to be a little bit lower because we're rooting for the home team or the visitors, whereas especially in public transit where people aren't necessarily kind of have this common affinity with others, we might be a little bit more uncomfortable and therefore more prone to check our phones. And so we've actually been able to show this by running experiments in subway systems of large cities. And how this works is the subway systems actually enable connection to a subway-specific cellular line. So if you imagine you're underground in a subway and you're automatically connecting to this line, the thing is, we also know kind of the dimensions of the train or the subway cars, the volume of it, and we can count how many people basically are connecting to the subway line. And may now come as no surprise, since we kind of set up this mobile immersion theory in the beginning, that people actually look at their phones more when they're in a crowd than when they're not in a crowd. So that kind of provides that other opportunity of figuring out where people are, but also what's going on around in their environment to kind of leverage that for marketing use. Okay, so if we get back out of the subway, other things that we're seeing is this idea of geofence. We're seeing companies actually doing it. They're putting geofences around car lots. Banks are doing this so they can try to identify prospects for auto loans. We see this on college campuses. If we see an individual who appears on different campuses, we might assume, okay, they're looking for colleges for their kid, or they themselves are looking for colleges for where they want to go. This might be a prime target to offer a student loan. Yes, so David Thierry is saying, if I do not want to be pinged with these ads, is there any way I can go dark to marketers while still having phone and data access available? David, this is an excellent question. And I actually was going to kind of get to this at the end, but we'll go ahead and we'll address it now. And at the end, it will make more sense. But there's two things going on. So let's say that or not let's say, but the two largest mobile operating systems are iOS, which is owned by Apple, and then Android, which is owned by Google. So in April of last year, what Apple did is they started forcing apps to ask users permission to track them. So basically track their activity across other apps or other websites. And apps that tracked users had to gain their permission if they wanted access to the unique identifier that Apple assigns to each device. Why they want that unique identifier is they use it for advertising purposes, or they go ahead and they sell it to data brokers. So if you have iOS, you could either, the options were ask to track or ask not to track. So you could grant or deny permission. You don't have to wait for that to come. What you can do is you can go into each individual apps and see what permissions are basically permissive, and you can toggle them, turn them on or turn them off. Google is planning on doing something similar in the near future. And the difference between Google and Apple is that whereas Apple is opt-in, so each individual app that tracks you has to ask your permission, Google is going to be opt-out. So you universally opt out of apps. And then within individual apps, you can adjust your preferences. If we have time in the end, just in case anyone's interested, this is actually a huge issue for intelligence services. So David, if you don't mind holding your question, which is honestly fantastic, the answer truly to your question, can I actually go dark but still have my phone? The answer is going to be yes and no. And I'll explain a little bit more why when we get there, but it's this whole idea of privacy and surveillance, etc., definitely is constantly seeing attention in legislative systems, within marketers who are the gatekeepers, and also within consumers, especially as more data breaches are coming to light, etc. So that's what makes this topic super, super interesting. Okay. So talking about this idea of geofencing, other examples that we're starting to use, so now we're going to go beyond marketers, okay? So David doesn't want to be pinged, but with an ad, that's fine, we'll back off. What are some other uses for understanding where consumers are? We'll use the example of Tesla. In 2018, CEO of Tesla, Elon Musk's, goes on record saying, we are going to triple the production of our Model 3S sedan. And nobody believed him because in the first quarter of 2018, they only produced 10,000 cars. So everyone was like, if you're barely cranking out 10,000, how can you triple it? There were some hedge funds that said, wait a second, there's a way we can test this beforehand to actually be ahead of the curve. So what they did is they teamed up with some mobile firms, and they said, look, we know where the Tesla factory is in California. It's in Fremont, okay? Why don't we set up a geofence around that factory? And what they did is they counted the number of cell phones that were breaching that geofence, so entering onto factory premises, as well as their timestamps, and when those cell phones were exiting. And over basically 6 months, so between June and October, they were really looking at the overnight workforce, and they found that the third shift actually tripled. So ahead of time, they actually believed, yeah, Elon is right. They are going to meet their projections. And so when they announced an unexpected profit, unexpected to most people because nobody believed him, a few of these hedge firms that were actually looking at this really made a lot of money because they were able to verify using basically, this is what we called alternative data, but kind of an indicator of the ability to meet those projections. We see this in other industries, such as if there's a crowd at oil bars, sand patches and things, then there's a greater likelihood that that company is successful in what they're tapping, etc. Okay, so a couple other things that we can use kind of with just understanding where people are is foot traffic. So when banks are making loans to commercial properties or retailers, a really good gauge of whether these retailers are going to continue to make profit, et cetera, is kind of seeing what stores people are going to. Even retailers themselves can see who their competitors are based on where people go after or before they come to their own stores, and also try to gauge trends ahead of time by seeing that shift in retailer loyalty. We've already seen this, for example, by measuring how much people change their shopping patterns when, after mass shootings happened in the US, certain retailers announced they were no longer selling guns and ammunition, and how people shifted their loyalty. So that's another example of data that can be very informative of trend and those kind of insights. Same thing, using real-time data, trying to improve in-store experiences. So a lot of museums are doing this, where if they can detect hotspots, they'll try to better manage the flow of traffic within the experience, because again, we don't like crowds, and see how they can better manage that. And how they decide this is basically using both in real time as well as historical data, data that's derived from mobile devices. Okay, one last thing about this idea of putting a virtual perimeter or a digital corral around a location. Remember how a couple slides ago we had said the idea behind it is that proximity indicates interest. It doesn't mean somebody's interested, but there's a higher likelihood someone is interested or at least open to considering a mobile promotion if they're within a vicinity of a store. We could argue the same thing happens if we're in the vicinity of a competitor. So for example, if I show up at Dunkin' Donuts instead of Starbucks, at least that indicates I'm open to coffee or donuts, since we're still at breakfast. So what we are also seeing is companies use what we call geoconquesting. Let's say we're located in a certain area of the city. We know where our competitors are, so we can actually put up virtual perimeters around our competitors and basically try to poach the customers of our competitors. A lot of people do this. Couple examples: IMAX Theater, Outback Steakhouse, even car dealerships. Okay, so other uses of mobile technology. Okay, Let's shift gears a little bit. So what we've been talking about has been largely derived from cell phone tower triangulation. And that really relies on knowing where people are in a real-time instance, okay? If I'm detected in the proximity of Dunkin' Donuts, but then I leave and at 3 p.m. somebody decides to send me a message, it's already too late. So that really leverages the necessity to know exactly when people or where people are in that moment. More and more, we're starting to see a shift towards using data that comes from mobile apps. So the data from tower triangulation, it's coming from cell phone towers. Mobile apps themselves, though, actually emit a lot of data. And so this type of data, you could argue, but it actually can come from anything that has geocoordinates. We can get it from satellite data, from photos that are geotagged, et cetera. But the bulk of the data that we're seeing coming out is coming from mobile apps. And so it helps to understand how this app tracking works. This really speaks to David's question. So what apps really want to do is they want to collect deterministic identifiers on individual users, okay? And the reason they want to do that is so that they can match that user across different apps or mobile websites. So for example, if I log into Facebook, TikTok, and Instagram with the same email address, apps are fairly certain it's the same person across these different apps. The next thing that they want to do, having obtained these deterministic identifiers, is they actually can collect 14 indicators of an individual's interest and behaviors. These indicators include browsing history, contact information, location data. We're going to focus a lot on location data in the next few slides, purchases, etc. Super, super personal and sensitive. Now, what they do then is they go ahead and they sell this data to data brokers, who then aggregate this data, both from other apps and other data brokers, and they create consumer profiles that they then sell on to marketers for targeting purposes. So that's why if anyone had an iOS device, basically an iPhone, starting in April, if they started seeing these apps asking them, can they track them? This is why. Big money, it's a $200 billion business. So how do apps do this? There's a software development kit. So tracking codes are embedded in SDKs in an app. And the app actually looks at where somebody is, and it can happen passively, where no interaction with the app is necessary for this to be detected in the background. Usual suspects are your ride-hailing apps, your location apps, your weather apps, apps where it's understandable that someone wants to know where we are to basically deliver us the information that we're seeking. Less usual apps are, let's say, gaming apps, banking apps, other apps that basically purport to want to know where an individual's location is in order to provide them better services. So a lot of apps are collecting location data basically in the background of phones. They're aggregating these data, selling it on to data brokers. So this brings us to the next question, going really back to David's question. Let's say that we actually purchase a data set from a data broker. And in this data set, our data happens to be, but I will say this, most of the time in these data sets, the location pings that are associated with the device, that device is anonymized. So the personal identifiers are stripped. Here's the question though. We actually can go ahead and de-anonymize the data set. And how we can do that is we can, based on the location pings of an individual device, make a prediction about who we believe that device belongs to. Because a lot of our daily behavior is basically a very unique trace of our mobility. Nobody is like us. So mom was right when she said, you're special. But the question is, how many pings or basically location lat longs would we need to basically de-anonymize somebody's device from anonymized data set? Okay, so I'm going to give you a hint. The answer ranges from 0 to 2,000. Go in the chat, see how much you believe we would need. Also see how close you can get. Somebody says 1, okay, 3, okay, 100, okay. The answer is 4. We only need, and this has been proven time and time again, 4 location data pings to, with high accuracy, de-anonymize an individual. A lot of people have shown this. We've got the New York Times, who's purchased a data set and showed that they could identify a middle school science teacher. They knew she had walked her dog in the park, she had gone to Weight Watchers, she slept overnight at her boyfriend's, and they knew the exact classroom she even taught in her middle school. Wall Street Journal has acquired a data set and showed we can identify the location of US soldiers in hotspots that wasn't supposed to be known. New York Times again has been showing law enforcement is actually using these location data to identify those who stormed the Capitol on January 6th. Okay, so what's really, really, you could argue, very highly sensitive, important about this type of data is it reveals a montage of an individual's life. Highly, highly revealing. So what are some of the things that we actually know? For example, we'll take myself. If in this data set we see that I appear during normal working hours at a certain location over even, let's say, 2 or 3 weeks, we can confidently assume this is where Michelle works. Michelle works at Emory University. Then we can try to assess what is the average salary. We believe her employer is Emory. If we try to see where her cell phone is pinging at night, we can assume that is the home base, okay? So not only things about home location, and then from the home base, what is the average home value, what are the demographics in that neighborhood from US Census data, etc. We can also infer things about an individual's lifestyle. If they're going to the gym a lot, they have health values. If they show up at church regularly, they're a religious person. If we see them at daycare before they go to work, they're a young parent. We can make that assumption. We can also infer things about their personalities. So for example, if, and this has already been shown in research, if somebody is showing up at bars a lot, there's a high likelihood they tend to be somebody who's an extrovert, because these are locations that enable those traits. The other thing that we can gather from this type of data is who your friends are. Because a lot of times if you are showing up in a data set along with somebody else at different locations, but repeatedly, fair assumption that either you work with this person or you are friends with this person. The other thing too is we can even infer influence from this. So let's say Pam, for example, is a foodie and really scopes out the newest pop-ups around town, and then goes ahead and tells Nicola, hey, this chef just opened a pop-up here, this restaurant has a really, really great small plate menu, etc. And frequently after we observe that Pam is at that location, we then observe that Nicola is at that location. We can then infer, at least when it comes to food, Pam is the one who influences Nicola's tastes and preferences. So there's a lot of things that we can get from this type of data.
Hey, Michelle?
Yes.
We had a question that came in that I was going to hold to the end, and it seems to fit right here because of what the example you've just given. So the question that Larry asked was, how personally identifiable is the information that marketers get, and what type of demographic info besides location is being shared? So clearly with the example you shared, they know it's, you know, 2 individuals that know each other. What more might they know?
Okay, from this data, what they can infer from this type of data is, let's say that we do not have your work or home base but most of the time we actually will have that type of data, and that data is very informative of basically what type of job you have, what your average salary is, how often you're traveling. If we restrict the data set only to the retailers that you're frequenting, that also gives an assessment of maybe average salary. So if you, for example, appear on a regular basis in high-end retailers, there is an inference about your, let's say, disposable income. There's you can match this data with the census data, but the location data alone is informative of what people do, how much money they have, what their interests are, what their personality is. So yes, on the one hand, it can be very scary. On the other hand, what marketers are trying to do with it is not only target the people that they believe are will be the most receptive to their communications, but also get a better understanding of who their customers are, by trying to understand what their customers do when they're not interacting with that retailer themselves. And so they're continually trying to get more information on customers. So when I had mentioned early on to David's question, when apps are asking, can we track you or not? If people deny that request, and a lot of people actually have, then firms don't get that what we do across apps information anymore. And so basically over the summer and even now, what we're seeing a lot of retailers do is scramble and try to get information on their own from customers. We've seen in stores these promotions where if you simply enter your email address, you get a chance to win, you know, a pickup truck full of avocados, things like that. But the mobile data itself, the reason it is highly informative is it tells, you could argue it tells a lot more about somebody that complements what they do online. So a lot of people can say, well, online, I do all my shopping. How could it tell anything about me? The thing is, pandemic aside, especially as more of us are getting out, etc., where we go, who we hang out with, how we spend our time indicates where our wallet share is going, and what is interesting us. So that's why it's super, super informative. Yes, there's a lot of issues around privacy that come along with it. So I'll go ahead and I'll kind of give one more example, and then we'll go ahead and open up for questions. But the example is this: trying to identify prospects based on their travel patterns. So I'm going to go ahead and say, in the olden days, before anyone had cell phones, how marketers would decide where to try to get people to spend more time in stores is they actually would set out these mats in front of, we'll say, grocery stores that actually had a substance that would stick to your shoe. So it was liquid enough it would stick, but not so sticky that people actually noticed it. And so people would step on these mats, and they were called desensitizing mats in case you had germs, and go and shop and leave the store. And what researchers would do is at night, they'd turn out the lights after the store was closed and take black lights and individually track each set of footprints throughout the store. So they could say, you know, this type of shopper tends to buy these products. They'd obviously match it, try to match it with sales receipts, etc. And so now we have stores like IKEA who has lit upon the idea that, well, if we can increase your time in the store by basically making it impossible to get out, you're more likely to buy more. Grocery stores have tried to do the same thing. We're now seeing malls do this using these Bluetooth devices by basically seeing what's the optimum layout of stores within the mall. How can we make sure we have enough people to indicate popularity but not be overcrowded, etc. And so this one last thing about identifying prospects is, it's an example I believe everybody knows, but years ago, Target sent pamphlets about baby products to a household, and a father got the pamphlets. The pamphlets were addressed to the daughter, who was a teenager. And the father basically had the daughter confess that she was pregnant. And the question was, how did Target know that she was pregnant before dad did? And it just so happens what Target does is they take the baby registries of everybody and they backtrack about 9 months, and they see what purchases of those consumers are different from a consumer that didn't have a baby registry. And they basically create an algorithm to flag anybody else to indicate the likelihood of not just being pregnant, but having a newborn maybe coming into the house. So when it comes to mobile data, in terms of identifying prospects, we can say, well, if we can identify an ideal customer who tends to have these mobility patterns, then based on all the other customers in our data set and their patterns, we can probably identify the next closest person who is not yet our customer, but we would really like to be. So those are just some examples. I know I'm running out of time, so I'm going to end on this. David alluded to this in the very beginning. Apps asking to track, that's what iOS is doing now. It's Apple's new app tracking transparency. So it kind of goes to David's question of, can he actually go dark? And this is where I'm gonna bring the answer full round. The answer is yes and no. Even if you have no apps on your phone is still trying to connect to cell phone towers. And towers can tell where a phone is. We've seen this come into the legal system where people have either been found not guilty of a suspected crime, or there's evidence to suggest they were at the scene of the crime based on their location pings. We see this both in the US as well as in Europe. The reason the answer is yes and no is if, for example, David then decides the best way to go dark is not to have a phone at all. As an ordinary citizen, that's not going to create any red flags for anybody, but it depends on who you are. And so the intelligence community is actually having a real big problem with this, because first of all, it's harder to actually mask identities, have to have biometrics and actual passport of an individual's identity when they go to another country. Let's say they get into that country, but they're trying to meet with a contact. People don't need to shadow them anymore. They can basically follow them on their phones. So what intelligence communities are trying to do is basically go ahead and spoof a cell phone's location so that, for example, let's say I'm an intelligence agent. If I can spoof my cell phone's location, I'm going to make it look like, oh, during 8 to 5, Michelle is at Emory University, and then go ahead and try to meet my contact in the city. But the second thing that needs to happen is we have now more and more facial recognition and basically closed caption cameras all over the city. And so now intelligence communities are trying to create algorithms to map out the fastest route that goes through blind spots. So no one can actually detect whether somebody actually was outside or not. I know that kind of goes a little bit beyond, so we'll go ahead and see if we have questions. I see Jim has a question. Is there a point of retailers going too far and risking their own brands by their aggressive approach to data and selling? As in the Target pregnancy example, the answer is yes, and it's yes on two fronts. So the first is, unfortunately, there's more and more incidences of data breaches. And when that happens, consumers become much more sensitive to privacy concerns, and they stop wanting to reveal information to retailers. So the idea behind revealing information is, well, if I tell you a little bit more about myself, you can give me some more personalization or, offer me better services. But the flip side is, if you're doing things with my data or you're not, able to control my data, then I'm going to trust you less as a retailer. The other thing is this idea of annoyance. So if we have been in an instance where we're, all of a sudden we get a notification on our phone because we're in proximity to a store, but we've never shopped at that store, we might find it creepy, etc. We're more likely to go into our phone, if we know how, but very user-friendly, and basically shut off more restrictions than we would have had we not been pushed to that point. So finding that line is tricky. I will say this, it's generation dependent. Any of us who have kids, teens, etc., they are completely fine sharing their location. They think nothing about it. And so firms are kind of grappling with, how far do we push versus how much is too much that we simply don't need. And so the gatekeepers tend to be those who kind of are in charge of amassing all this data. Let's talk about our big tech firms, Google, Apple. And what they're doing is twofold. They're starting to say, okay, let's give more permission to consumers. Okay, but on the other hand, they're creating what we call walled gardens, where they're saying, well, we have all the information. So if you want to do ad targeting, you got to pay us. So we're seeing this constant battle also between firms and legislation. What about using a VPN? Does that hide the info of an individual? So what a VPN does is it hides the internet behavior, but it doesn't hide the location behavior because there's too many devices that are picking up an individual's location. What are the most common ways to program marketing and tracking tools to feed one more desirable information or choices? That's constantly evolving. So early on, it used to be basically this, you could argue, fairly simple, okay, geofence, etc. But now as more information and much more informative information is coming from mobile data, and it still is super, super easy to kind of de-anonymize this data. Apps are trying to get a better understanding of their consumers. And based on that, giving them more, personalized recommendations to kind of nudge purchases within apps or with partnership apps and retailers. But the other thing too is this is an incredibly expansive, you could argue, opportunity or context that we're seeing because of this. A lot of us have what are called connected devices. We've got smartwatches, we now have smart cars, smart appliances, we have virtual assistants in our home, and all of these devices are communicating together and they're actually collecting information. And so more and more, it's really, really hard to kind of conceal that information. But the more data, the idea is that firms can collect, the more they know about an individual or a subset of a customer segment, and maybe the better able they are to provide services to that segment. What are the existing or pending government regulations around protecting consumers' privacy? Constantly evolving. Huge difference between US and Europe. So Europe basically has the GDPR. You have the right not to be tracked. That has significantly reduced firms' ability to do targeted advertising online as well as on mobiles. In the US, we do have some restrictions, but they tend to be very location specific. So for example, in San Francisco, you're not allowed to do facial recognition anymore. But in New York, insurance firms are totally allowed to go to individuals' social media accounts and base insurance on what they find in those accounts. So if I'm always smoking a cigarette at bars and I post that on my social media accounts, insurance is probably going to be like, yeah, super high for Michelle. Some other instances of what we're seeing in terms of regulation is so it's twofold. We might have what we call privacy controls in place, but so far, those controls place the burden on consumers to exercise the right to control their privacy. Prime example is ad choices. It's that little tiny triangle blue icon that you see on ads when you're online and you're browsing. A lot of people actually don't know if they click on the ad choices icon and then they go ahead and say, don't track me across different websites, they're not going to get personalized ads. The thing is that tends to be very fragile. As soon as you reset your cookies, etc., it flips back to, oh, we're tracking you now. The thing about Apple's Ask to Track policy is it's unique in that it's incredibly salient. When you open an app, immediately after the policy went into place, you got this notification that your behavior could be tracked across other apps or websites. Do you agree or not? And they also made opt-out very easy. You either grant or deny permission. So we're maybe going to be seeing down the line a lot more transparency on the consumer side about what's allowed or not. The thing is, we're seeing this a twofold thing, both in legislature as well as in courts, about what information that is gleaned from our personal devices are allowed in both the judicial system and what are firms allowed to collect on us. I know that's a long-winded answer, but the thing is, the answer is constantly evolving and is very multifaceted. Posting a queue from chat, are employers using mobile apps to track employees? Ooh, other than delivery and transport employees, are there any privacy protections to prevent that? The answer is no. So for anybody who follows sports, we have seen football coaches, for example, have a company phone, and they're allowed to basically get all the text from the phones. And so football coaches have gotten in trouble with the NCAA for illegal recruitment, for what society deems inappropriate activities between adults, etc. And that information has been used to basically void contracts, fire people, etc. So the answer actually depends on who owns the device and therefore owns the permissions. And again, constantly evolving. I have a feeling, so we
Michelle.
Yes.
Yeah, we've got one or two questions in the chat that I wanted to bring to your attention, and one I think is directed to you. Since you know so much about how these companies are surveilling, selling, and/or exploiting our data, do you maintain any real accounts, or are all of your accounts fake?
So this is a very personal question. I'm glad we all feel comfortable enough to know each other. So I will say this. I would say on a regular basis, what I do is I constantly check the permissions on my apps. The thing that you could argue is tricky / not fair is apps are constantly updating their privacy policies that are like 10 pages long that no one reads, and then telling you, hey, we updated it. And you basically have no choice but to say, okay, fine, I agree, in order to use the apps. So understanding kind of what information, and nobody has to understand, but if you go into the app, you can see kind of what information, such as location information, is being collected, contact information, things like that. I would say I don't need to be the one saying this, but there are multiple instances of both in the court system as well as employers, now insurers, basically using information that they can collect from social media or anything that's considered public, and using that either for or against individuals. I'm not saying that we all need to basically rid ourselves of devices. Devices, help facilitate our lives, stay in touch with people, etc. But maybe being careful about some of the information that we are allowing devices or apps, or that we're putting out there, maybe something to consider. I think is especially important for the younger generation, who tends to have a much more open mind and attitude and trust with it. And I think trust goes both ways, though. Yeah, I don't know if that answers an individual's information, but I think it depends on either what an individual is hoping to, I don't want to say the word hide, but keep private, versus is okay revealing. So yeah.
I think it's interesting, Michelle. RJ posted that they were driving, listening to this while in the car, pulled up to a light, and across the street was Wayfield Foods. And guess what? A Google Chrome geolocation request came through. So I think that's just really timely. Michelle, really quick, we have time for a real short answer. We have one more question that was posted, and that is, wouldn't there be some disparity and almost prejudicial bias in the type of information being fed in the individuals if that information is solely based on traffic, geolocation and your buying patterns?
Yes, fantastic question. Really, really good question. And this is why. At the government level, in terms of coming up with public policy and regulation, we're seeing a couple things. First of all, is people are dropping out of data sets because they're being more careful about what information they allow. So we're not observing them anymore. Governments are obtaining non-representative samples of people. If you base policies on a non-representative sample, that doesn't have really good implications. Let's go to that banking system. Or the bank's use of location data. If banks are basically basing loan information on how many people are coming in and out of a factory, but they're not accounting for other information such as, we just bought a 3D printing machine, so we don't need to have 3 employees. That's why we now only have 1. It doesn't mean that we are now making less, money. It just means you're not seeing as many employees come in. And certainly the idea of purchases and traffic, making sure that we understand how representative the data can be, what data can be missing, is super important. So just to take it at face value and not ask those follow-up questions can be dangerous.
Great. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you so much for all this somewhat scary.
I didn't mean to make it scary, but
no, it's so informative. It really is informative. And, we just really appreciated you spending your time with us this morning to share these insights with our audience. I want to share a little bit about what's coming up next for our Business Over Breakfast sessions in April and May. So the first is global supply chain innovations, and to the point of using data and analytics. How are companies using data and analytics to inform strategy and key decisions, and especially how to better match supply and demand in their supply chain? Following that, we'll be examining our COVID-induced behaviors. Is it really a new habit or is it just a trend? And this will be examining the food delivery industry. Dan McCarthy is an expert in this area and has done a lot of research. And then the rise of virtual social technologies. Rajiv Garg is a kind of a passion for him. He'll be sharing insights there. Then I do want to highlight, Nicola mentioned several things in our introduction about some of our upcoming courses and opportunities, and I wanted to highlight a few of those. Of course, our executive communications and leadership presence is always a really impactful course for many. Nicola spoke about the marketing analytics certificate. You can check that out on our website under the certificates drop-down box. And then she also mentioned the negotiation and influence, where we'll be kicking off the use of our virtual avatar simulation for the first time. So it'd be fun to be a part of that kind of experience, turning into new ways of learning. We hope that you have enjoyed this session today. We look forward to seeing you the first and third Thursday of every month, and we wish you a happy St. Patrick's Day. Take care and have a good rest of the day.